Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody out there. Welcome yet again to a Thursday live stream. We're delighted to have you here with us again today. Just a couple of little things from me before we get started. Next Thursday, a week from today, we bring back one of our favorite speakers, a true character and source of great information. This is Mike Vigil. He was, of course, with the DEA and its international unit for many, many years. He is full of stories and opinions and ideas and experience. And I asked him to really talk about whatever he wanted to talk about and bring in whoever he wanted to talk about, or sorry, bring in whoever he wanted to join the conversation. So he's brought in two gentlemen. One worked with the IRS on money laundering issues as pertains to the drug cartels in Mexico. And then another individual who worked with the ATF and who actually was part of the Waco raid as an ATF agent, and then worked really on weapons issues and how they flow from the United States to Mexico and are ultimately a big source of power for the drug cartels. So that's next Thursday. It's going to be really interesting. There's a lot happening in Mexico too, with of course what happened with General Cienfuegos and his eventual extradition back to Mexico, and then his pardon by the Mexican government. And now the Mexican government has denied diplomatic immunity to US agents working in Mexico, which is a great way to prohibit American entities from really leading the drug interdiction charge. So that's next Thursday. The following Wednesday, on February 24th, we launch our Russia Disruption series. We've got some really big names coming on that, and the kickoff is no slouch either, with Paul Colby, who is a brilliant mind and currently at Harvard after a long career in the CIA. And then we'll have a Russian journalist, Evgenia Albats, who is also just kind of has a staggering career. And then we'll also bring in Sean Walker, who is with The Guardian and was the Moscow correspondent for many years and has written all kinds of things on the topic. So all the information, of course, is on our website, sfcir.org. And if you want immediate things sent to your email inbox, sign up if you haven't already for our news digest. And that goes out every Wednesday with all kinds of details. We have great decisions coming up again next week. We've got so many things going on, and we're glad that you're joining us for this great ride in this bizarre virtual world that we're all in. And I hope you're all staying safe. And if you've gotten your vaccine, I hope that that's agreed with you well. And if not, let us hope that the access to this vaccine continues, because it is certainly time. So with all that said, let me now bring in today's speakers. And we're thrilled to have three former ambassadors with us today, one from France and one from the UK, and one you may recognize from the United States. Well, let me start with Robert Dewar, Bob Dewar. He, of course, was formerly the British High Commissioner in Nigeria and Mozambique, as well as the British ambassador to Madagascar and Ethiopia. He also served as the UK permanent representative to the African Union. Welcome, Bob. It's great to have you here with us. We're thrilled that you can join this conversation. And then let me also introduce, just to his side, Stefan Gompertz. He was the French ambassador for climate in Africa and the Middle East, ambassador to Austria, director for Africa and the Indian Ocean, and ambassador to Ethiopia, among other posts. You may at home have noticed a thread that links our three ambassadors in terms of their many connections to Ethiopia and to Africa more broadly. And of course, today's moderator and speaker extraordinaire is Ambassador Vicki Huddleston, who led 4 US diplomatic missions abroad in Cuba, Mali, Madagascar, and Ethiopia. So welcome you all. Welcome back once again, Vicki, and let me turn everything over to you now. And folks out there, ask your questions in the Q&A box and we'll get to them in about 40 minutes. Good morning, Vicki. Welcome, and let me hand over the reins to you.
Thank you, Sandy. This is a real privilege for me to have on this program with me both Bob and Stefan, who are such accomplished individuals and who, as Sandy mentioned, I served with in Ethiopia. But today we're going to talk about the view from Europe. And I'm going to start off talking a little bit about President Biden's recent foreign policy speech. The wonderful thing about the speech was that he gave it to the State Department. And I think you all know that the State Department is in a situation of feeling demoralized after the Trump administration. And to have the president go over there and give this wonderful speech which talked about the return of the United States to the world of diplomacy and to our alliances. President Biden said, America is back. And so I think I'm certainly hoping that this is true, but I'm very interested to know how Bob and Stefan feel about this. And I'm going to start out with Bob and say, can we just turn the switch and be back on and be part of the alliance, or have things changed too much? Where are we now?
Thank you, Vicki. Firstly, greetings to everyone in Santa Fe and its Council for International Relations and beyond from a very wintry Britain. And thank you, a very big thank you for the invitation to be with you. It's great to be with old friends, both yourself and Stefan. Of course, these days I can only speak on a personal basis, but delighted to discuss such interesting issues at this pivotal time. So my reaction to what you've just said and to President Biden's speech is welcome back, America. And I think the Biden administration's first days have been like a 100-meter sprinter out of the blocks, showing where America, the new America, wants to go, re-engaging with the United Nations, with the World Health Organization, with the Climate Change Convention, and making other important policy statements too. These may be the easy bits, but they are a great signal. So welcome back, America. So far as the UK is concerned, and I'm sure Europe, we want to be close allies of America in going forward. And let's renew faith right now in the world's multilateral system. Do it together, bring back predictability, and bring back values on the basis of mutual respect. And in rebuilding those alliances and coalitions, also recognizing the world isn't what it was when we were together in Ethiopia in 2005, or even the world of 4 years ago. It has moved on a bit. But I think at a time when we in the UK are renewing our own place in the world after Brexit, we would want to help President Biden on very many issues. And I'm sure our Prime Minister is looking forward to seeing him at the G7 in Cornwall. Soft power, I'd just like to start with, because I do think President Biden has touched a key point by saying that performance matters. And I think that should be performance over time for all of us, predictability over time, the return of predictability based on values and performance. And that can restore trust and soft power. An unpredictable world with unpredictable leaders is high risk for all of us. So I think it's time now for the principled center to hold a rules-based international system everyone can buy into. But there's work to be done.
A lot of work to be done, but I think we're very relieved and happy to hear you say you welcome back the United States. And that makes me think about France, which is also one of our oldest allies. And President Macron gave a really interesting talk with the Atlantic Council the other day, and he returned to one of the principles of France that we've heard since de Gaulle, and it's very important. And that's about Europe's sovereignty, Europe's responsibility for itself. And indeed, in the last 4 years, Europe had to take responsibility not only for itself, but for Russia, for North Africa, etc. So, Stefan, how do we dovetail this? How do we make Europe and Britain holding Britain now that it's out of the European Union, and then the United States? All of us have sovereignty issues and national interests. But yet we need to be strong as alliance. How do we do this? Oh, you're on mute. Stefan, you're on mute. There we go.
Oh, all right, good. Can you hear me? Good. It's good. Vicki, Bob, Sandy, it's wonderful to see you and to hear you. Hello, everybody. Good evening or good morning, wherever you are. Here it's good evening. We also have a very frosty winter. We had snow 2 days ago. It's beautiful, all white in the countryside.
Wow.
I don't want to interfere in US domestic policy, politics, but clearly we were delighted by Joe Biden's victory. For us, it means, as you said, as Bob said, that America is back, diplomacy is back, as Biden said to US diplomats at State Department. And clearly there's a high demand, I think all over Europe, all over the world, I would say, for a stronger and more reliable US. The fact that the President Biden already has had a lot of contacts with his counterparts is obviously positive. Biden and Macron had a very good conversation on the 24th of January. And now I'm quoting our presidency's communique. There was a very large convergence of views between the two, which obviously is not surprising. I'd like to add that the fact that the new Secretary of State speaks French like a Frenchman is also very positive from our point of view. It doesn't mean that he's going to approve of everything we say. We don't expect that, but at least he can understand us perfectly. We also welcome the return to a real professionalism. When she accompanied President Biden to the State Department, Kamala Harris said, "America will deliver." And this is indeed what we expect from the US, that US really delivers on her promises. I'd also like to stress that more than ever, we share common values. We'll probably speak about human rights later on, but clearly democracy is at stake. And particularly now, when the Western democracy, liberal democracy, is challenged by other models, and especially by China. China is a partner. We'll speak about China later. But there is a temptation in certain parts of the world to turn to a kind of Chinese model because they're supposed to be more efficient, even if it means abandoning our freedoms. And clearly, it is our common interest for America and for European countries to demonstrate that democracy can work, that we can both be efficient and respect the fundamental freedoms and rights of our citizens. And therefore, working together to revitalize the alliance is an essential task. Now, it doesn't mean that we're going to agree on everything. We should nurture no illusions. There will be disagreements, there will be different views, and that's part of life. But clearly there's going to be, we're quite confident in this, there's going to be a much better understanding of what we think and what we want to achieve together.
Let me take you up on it, and we'll draw Bob into this too, since you brought up the issue of human rights. And I think in a way, and rule of law too, that is a key issue, because when we deal with our competitors, and in some ways one might say adversaries, that's a key issue. In Russia, we now have Navalny, who was poisoned by the Russians and returned and now is back in jail. So we have a huge human rights concern there. And in the case of China, we have the Uyghurs, and some people have called this a genocide, putting them in camps, forced labor, maybe forced sterilization. So Russia and China are key on many issues such as trade, nuclear proliferation, cyber. How do we balance this difference between wanting to get along and at the same time trying to defend and respect and hold up the importance of rule of law and human rights? Either one of you, go ahead.
Who wants to start? Bob, do you want to start, or should I do it?
You carry on, Stefan.
All right. Obviously, it's a difficult issue. It's an issue we've been facing for a long time. On the one hand, it's true that we're witnessing very shocking violations of human rights, and you quoted good examples. And clearly, if we want to be respected, even by those countries, we shouldn't be silent about them. We have to say clearly what we think. It doesn't mean that we have to make public statements all the time. We have to strike a balance between what we say in public, what we say privately, the kind of pressure we can apply. This is a matter of diplomacy, but clearly we shouldn't keep silent. On the other hand, we should not demonize them either, because Russia, China, and other countries are partners. Vicki, you quoted certain essential areas like addressing the issue of nuclear proliferation, the issue of violence, and obviously terrorism. We shouldn't forget that both Russia and China can themselves be subject to great big attacks by terrorist movements, which also cost in their countries a number of human lives. And in a way, we are facing the same enemy, either in our respective countries or abroad. And that, for instance, applies to African continent, which is dear to us, where all of us served, and we served together. And we should not neglect the field of counterterrorism, terrorist issues, just because of human rights. So we have to strike a balance. It's not always very easy, but I think that our partners can perfectly understand our attitude and even listen to us. Obviously, we have to be psychologically apt to pass on messages, but we've done that in the past, and we'll continue to do it. And sometimes we have obtained results. So I'm still reasonably optimistic that we can, to a certain extent, deliver on those issues.
I think exactly as you say, it's a question really of dialogue and cooperation on multilateral international issues where our interests coincide, and drawing a clear line in the sand where our interests differ, e.g., for example, over our values and the behavior, international behavior where those don't coincide with ours, including human rights. And the problem is, of course, that regimes like China, indeed Russia, are instinctively against allowing accountability and transparency to blossom in their countries. And this is the basic fundamental difference that there is in the world. And these liberal values and human rights are basically who we are. So we do need to draw that line in the sand, and to do so in a consistent and coherent way between us all. There is a saying, isn't there? We all know it, that when the threads unite, they can tie the lion, which is an Ethiopian saying. And there's a Madagascar saying as well, united we are rock, divided we are sand. And I think on these issues, we need to take measures. We have to decide what measures they are. And we need to show that there is that line in the sand. But you're quite right, in the wider sense, there are these fundamental international issues on which all great powers are concerned, which does include, of course, counterterrorism and the whole question of dialogue over disarmament, non-proliferation, international standards, including against new international threats, and looking to the future, space. You know, we've got to work together on how we work together in these areas, as we did in the sea.
I think, you know,
if you permit me, I'd like to add something on something more specific on Russia. I completely agree with what Bob had just said. Concerning Russia, there have been a lot of discussions among European countries and also Western allies on what to do, what measures to adopt vis-a-vis Russia. And one of the issues at stake is the Nord Stream pipeline, which is supposed to bring natural gas to Western Europe. And we know that it's quite important for Germany because Germany is to a large extent dependent on Russian gas. There have been, on the other hand, voices, including in France, even government voices saying that perhaps we should freeze, at least for the time being, freeze the project as a kind of countermeasure against what the Russians have done in the Navalny case. Now, I don't know what we're going to do. Our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Le Drian, said just a couple of days ago that it should be up to the Germans to decide because they have bigger stakes than we do. For us, it's less important because, as you know, 70% of our electricity comes from nuclear energy. So we're much less dependent on natural gas, generally speaking, and particularly on Russian natural gas than others. But obviously, we have to take into account German fundamental interests. So again, it's a question of balance. I don't know what we're going to decide, but clearly we're going to gauge advantages and disadvantages of each solution.
So in a way, I think we're very idealistic, all of us, and particularly President Biden. President Biden, in his State Department speech, said that we have to respect rule of law, equality, opportunity, that essentially we need to make it a better world. He said, and I love this, I want to quote it. He says, the grounding wire of our global policy and our global power are these universal human rights and rule of law. So why these values are important, but can we preserve them in the face of China, as you mentioned in your remarks initially, Bob, in the face of proposing a different model?
I think we can. I think the challenge, Stefan has brought that out. The challenge is that we put these values into action, and we have our own societies within which we must do that to show the world how we can succeed. And by putting them into action, we've also got to deliver for our citizens a better life as well, using our new technology, using our innovation. That is a challenge to our societies. So that on the economic side, people can say, well, this system doesn't just give us rights and so on, but it also gives us a better quality of life. I think that is the challenge, and to include everyone in our societies so they don't feel excluded and feel instinctively they want to have a Britain first policy rather than an outward leaning policy. I think it can be done. I think we need to cooperate with China in areas where our interests coincide, and that includes climate change and economic issues and others. And because that's important for all of us, it's going to be win-win. But draw that line in the sand. These values do matter, and they build our own influence. Mutual respect within the law, freedom of expression, individual choice and freedoms, peaceful debate at the heart of democracy. It's that culture that actually does appeal to so many people around the world, and that adds up to our soft power. I think it can be done.
Stefan, did you want to make a comment on that?
Well, I totally agree with what Bob has just said. Obviously, it's not easy, but I think there's no contradiction between safeguarding our interests and cooperating with those essential partners, Russia, China, and others on one hand, and reaffirming our principles on the other hand. Again, even they would not understand our silence on those issues if we decided to forget completely about them. It doesn't mean that we have to be naive. We know that it's not going to be easy, and we don't expect the issue of Navalny, of the Uyghur, to be solved immediately. But clearly, we have to restate our principles in all relevant fora and also discreetly and try and work for results. But on the other hand, we have a lot to do with those countries as well for the peace of the world, against terrorism, trade, multilateral cooperation, climate change, etc.
Well, if we don't get it right, we face some existential threats. And I think that makes it even more timely and more serious, because there are 3 existential threats that it seems to me are now worse than they have been in a long time. The first is nuclear, because we only have one agreement left. Fortunately, Putin and Biden did extend the START agreement, but there are 7 countries now who are nuclear powers. And this umbrella that the United States used to provide, or still provides, in the case of South Korea and Japan and Taiwan, is now being doubted because of our past 4 years. So they're number one, nuclear. How do we work with our adversaries, our competitors, Russia and China, on this existential threat, which is beginning to look as if other countries are thinking maybe the United States isn't going to live up to its nuclear umbrella? Bob, do you want to take that on?
Well, I'd put the question back to you a bit. I mean, in terms of the last statement, because it is important that there is a negotiation, that there is progress on these issues to prevent proliferation. There's danger of it widening to new players. And the role and intentions of the United States administration are going to be pretty crucial here. If this is going to be a collaborative and predictable and negotiated process. And I'll put that back to you to some extent. What do you think is possible with the administration?
Well, I think this administration understands it's really important. Stefan, how does France see this? I mean, as you said, France has uses nuclear energy for 70% of its energy. That's very, very unusual, and shows the advantage of the peaceful use of nuclear energy. And maybe it could even wean Germany off its pipeline to Russia. But how would you deal with this issue? I think it's at the top of Biden's list, but not quite. I think climate change and the pandemic are higher up, and we'll go to them just after
we go to them.
This.
Well, Vicki, you're mentioning two different issues here. One is nuclear energy as nuclear energy. I mean, peaceful use of nuclear energy, and clearly each country has to make its own choices. We have decided to rely on nuclear energy heavily. We're being criticized for that. I remember when I was ambassador to Austria, my Austrian friends would be highly critical of France and also the Czech Republic, their neighbors, because we use nuclear energy, which sometimes led to strange decisions. For instance, at a certain stage, I don't know if I can't remember if it was the Austrian parliament or the government, but anyway, they decided that they would check the origin of all the electricity they would import from foreign countries. So technically, that means that they had to stop every electron which traveled at the speed of 300,000 kilometers per second to say, hey, stop a moment, are you nuclear or not? It was absolutely nonsense. I remember talking with the then Minister of the Economy and raising the issue, and he laughed and said, no, this is only political. But it's only to illustrate the fact that nuclear energy can be quite contentious. But we have made that choice. The Germans have made a different choice, what they call Energiewende, which in our view is not a very wise decision because it tends to prolong the use of fossil fuels and especially of coal. But it's their choice and we have to respect it. So that's one issue. The other one is the military use of nuclear weapons as a deterrent. Obviously, it's not our intention to use them, God forbid, but we cannot rule it out. Otherwise, the threat wouldn't be credible. And the key word in that respect is credibility. But that does not only apply to nuclear weapons, it applies to all our foreign policy. And sorry, I'm going to be critical of the United States on one occasion. It was before Trump arrived in Syria. Rightly or wrongly, the Western powers decided that Bashar should not be allowed to use chemical weapons in Syria. If he did, there would be reprisals. Again, I'm not saying we were right or we were wrong, but this is what we, in common, we decided. And then Bashar used chemical weapons. And the US decided not to do anything. And since the US had decided not to do anything, there was nothing we could do because we didn't have the military means to do it. So all the West lost its credibility. And I think it was very negative. Again, I'm not saying it was at the beginning the right measure to take. But since we had decided to take such measures, we had to go along, which we didn't. And the question of credibility is essential. Now I'm going back to what you said about the nuclear umbrella, which the US is offering to, especially to Asian countries, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. It's a matter of credibility. If the other countries are persuaded that the US is determined, if need be, to use her arsenal, then they will probably abstain from acting foolishly. So it's very psychological, but the psychological component of the nuclear weapon is essential. Now, as you rightly said, it has become much more difficult because, unfortunately, the number of countries which are able to use nuclear weapons in the world has increased. And this is why the issue of Iran, we might have, I don't know if you intend to discuss Iran, but the issue of Iran is essential. We really hope that President Biden's to go back to the negotiating table, to go back to the comprehensive agreement with Iran, will help us achieve a reasonable solution with a win-win game for all the parties involved.
Well, go ahead and comment on that. I mean, on Iran, Wendy Sherman is the Deputy Secretary of State, and she was the principal negotiator under Kerry of the Iran nuclear agreement. So I think my answer to Stefan is yes, yes, we want to go back in, but I see that Iran has some preconditions. But Bob, do you want to comment on this? And then
my feeling, but here I'm not expressing my government's views. It's a personal view. But my feeling is that the West is raising a very delicate issue with Iran. I don't know if you and Bob will agree with me on this, which is the missile issue. Because what we're saying is also what President Macron said, including when he spoke to the Atlantic Council, was that if we manage to secure an agreement with Iran on nuclear issues, the question of missiles should also be addressed. Now, I know that this issue is highly sensitive to the Iranians. You know, I was struck, I've been to Iran twice, and I visited, among others, the Museum of the Revolution and how is it called, Secret Defense of the country, something like that. And there's a whole long discourse about the terrible threat and terrible destructions brought about by Saddam Hussein's missiles during the war between Iraq and Iran. So for the Iranians, it's a question of survival. They want to be able to defend themselves. Now, obviously, it doesn't mean that they should have intercontinental missiles which could reach Europe, the US, Asia, whatsoever, and also attack their neighbors. But clearly, this is a very sensitive and perhaps the most sensitive issues, at least for the Iranian establishment. I don't have the solution in hand. I'd just like to mention it. It's tricky.
Yes, well, I'm not as well informed as you are, Stefan or Vicki, on Iran, but I think I think reviving the nuclear deal and working towards that is a very sensible move. But as I was saying earlier, things have moved on since 4 years ago, and one has to reflect that in the pragmatism with which one moves, I think.
I don't think it's going to be easy, but I certainly think it's important. And I agree with Stefan, we'll probably have to leave the missiles out of it. That's why they were left out the last time around. Bob, climate change. I know this is pretty near and dear to you. And I'm really happy that we're back into the climate change agreement. And this is an existential issue. But it's also a domestic issue of jobs and perceptions. Talk about how we need to approach this to get more citizens on board in all our countries, but in particular mine.
Well, I personally think America has always been doing quite well on climate change because it's not just the government, it's not just the federal government, it's the states, it's the cities, it's the people. There are lots of people doing brilliant things on new technology, which is going to be really important. And I think, just this reinvigoration of the, shall we say, the determination of the US to give a lead on this area as well is going to have a dramatic effect. Certainly re-energizes the whole world system, who need the United States alongside in what needs to be a very ambitious agenda coming to Glasgow in November. So if you just take the multiple issues involved, I think that there is a big agenda to change your country's fuel choices and energy choices and transport choices within the next decade, as there is with us, working to renewable energy and electric cars. That is a huge industrial process which will need to be triggered with national and state legislation, and it'll change all of us because we will have to change our behaviors. I think other ways of getting us to change our behaviors as well through industrial processes is really important. I think the plastics industry need to step up to the mark. It's disgraceful that you have 8 million more tons of plastic going into the oceans every year. Right. And this is just awful. It requires a change in industrial process. Big business has got to change and start looking towards net zero. All our stock exchanges need to change by actually adding value to companies that are being serious about net zero, and so on. There are lots of multiple, shall we say, influences that affect our lives. And then we ourselves have to look at ourselves. What are we doing? How are we behaving? Do we take this as a crisis? What are we eating? What are we, how are we traveling around? What are we doing about travel internationally and whatever? We need to change. It's a crisis, and there are multiple ways in which this can happen. Obviously, it has to be made real. So maybe within your state, I don't know whether New Mexico and so on has got lots of ideas and is doing stuff that is really inspiring the young, but get the young on board, and they will be the real influences in this direction, because they know it's a crisis. It's their planet, the one that inheriting from us. We've messed it up. It's their planet. Let them tell us a bit about how energetic we need to be. It's not a process, it's an emergency.
Stefan, do you want to add to that?
Well, I couldn't agree more. I also agree with Bob on the fact that even under Trump, even if at the federal level, obviously the US was pulling back, a lot of cities and US companies continue to make some steady progress against climate change. And that's very, very encouraging. I think the trend is continuing. Now, I'm not saying that all those companies are philanthropists, but they clearly see where they're interested is. And we see that many major oil companies invest more and more in new and renewables. I remember talking to a friend of mine who was working for a big Anglo-Dutch oil company. And he told me that they had abandoned a big, huge project in Asia, oil project, because they wanted to diversify into new and renewables. Total, our group, is about to change its name. It's going to be called Total Energies, plural, in order to indicate that indeed they will not be only concentrated on oil. Now, obviously, there's a lot of propaganda in this, but I think it's a genuine trade. It will continue. Now, it's probably much too slow. It should be accelerated. As Bob rightly said, it's up to each of us to make the necessary efforts. But I think there's a growing awareness, and the fact that Joe Biden now has decided to go back to the Paris Agreement is obviously very encouraging.
Yes, and Biden has already taken some steps in preservation of national monuments.
Indeed, yeah.
To include out here in the West. I promised our audience that we'd talk a little bit about wars of the future. And by that, I basically meant two things. The first is cyber and manipulation of genes, and also fake information, and how we deal with that. Can we get to an international accord? Because I think in some ways, this ability of even small nations like Iran to interfere in our communications, in our computer networks, can lead to actual real war with weapons, perhaps even of mass destruction. Bob, do you want to take that on?
Yeah, I think it's a two-track thing, isn't it? One is we must be prepared, we must be technologically, we have to invest sufficiently, we must get advanced in this whole area of cyber. We must have good cyber security and be able to respond also to cyber attacks. But at the same time, I think we do need to work towards an international agreements in this and other areas. There are a number of areas, aren't there? I think you might also take new weapons, drones, we might take space, you might take internet governance, which I think you mentioned. You know, all of this needs international agreement, rules of engagement. That's not going to take, not going to be done very quickly, but it's really essential that it is done because it affects all of us. But meanwhile, to be responsible to our own citizens, we need to have institutions in place that can tackle and deter these new attacks. We must be prepared. We must really be at the forefront of the technology, but at the same time work for those international agreements that should be put in place, and that includes the internet. It includes on social media, doesn't it? There's got to be a better way of regulating social media than just the individual, the man or the woman at the head of a large corporation making a personal decision. It's got to be regulated. These are our new. This is our new environment. It's a new world we live in. We just haven't caught up quite. And I think the standards we want are for every country, including the big powers, obviously, to comply with these new standards of behavior and new international law and get that compliance. And also there needs to be a way in which we can prevent impunity in breaking international law. So those are two big challenges. It's very true because just to take international law as an example, we've seen a lot of breaking of it, including international humanitarian law, over the last couple of decades. Look at what's happened in Syria and other theaters of war, where international humanitarian law has been flouted. But we've got to work slowly and coherently, all of us, back towards a common agreement on these areas, in my view.
Vicki, if you allow me, I'd like to add a few points. Again, I agree with Bob has said. It's become very boring because we keep agreeing with each other. But Vicki, yeah, do you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, Okay, good. 3 points. I agree with Bob said. First, new wars, wars of your future. You and Bob mentioned drones. I've been struck by the fact that the drones have been a key element of the victory of Azerbaijan against Armenia, Turkish-made drones. And we see that also in the Sahel. One of the reasons why we think it is essential for the US to continue to help us in fighting terrorism in the Sahel region is the fact that the US has technological means which we don't have or don't have yet, like refueling aircraft, intelligence mechanisms, and drones. And I'm quite convinced that they're going to develop more and more in the future. So we're just at the beginning of a process, but we have to plan in advance and be able to deliver. Which leads me to my second point. I realize that I haven't answered your question, Vicki, on the strategic autonomy of the European Union. So sorry about that, but I will try and catch up very briefly. We are very much in favor of coordinating with NATO and with the US because we're allies and we share common interests. But we think that on certain occasions, as Macron said to the Atlantic Council, and this has been, as you said, our attitudes for a long time since de Gaulle, that we have to be able to decide by ourselves what our key interests are and what decisions we should take. And it would even be in the advantage of other members of the alliance, including the US, because we would be a more reliable partner. And that applies to the political decision-making process, to military means, and to technological means. We have to develop our own capabilities, which, by the way, also indicates that we should spend more on defense, and on this, the US has a very strong argument, and we recognize it. Third point, beyond the military aspect of the question, one of the challenges we are facing is whether our states are able to deliver and to control the way communication is used throughout the world, and sometimes against us. It can be very true in the case of terrorism. One of the terrorists' main weapon is the internet. They publish messages on Facebook, Instagram, Telegram, whatever, and serve their propaganda. Are we able to counter them? I'm not sure we're able yet, but clearly this is something we should develop. But even domestically, what can be left to private companies and what should be a privilege of the state? There have been a lot of discussions in the US and throughout the world on the decision taken by Twitter to cut Donald Trump's account. Now, there are two questions there. First, were they right to do it? Personally, I think that they were right to do it, and they should have done way before. But second, should it be a privilege of a private company to take such a political decision? And clearly, we have to discuss the matter. This is what Macron said recently. We have to discuss it among ourselves, among democracies, to try and set up, and there I'm going back to what Bob has just said, to try and define more precisely the rules of the game.
I would love to follow up some more, but I have to turn it over to questions. But before I turn it over to questions, the three of us, excuse me, we're in Addis Ababa at a very difficult time. And fortunately, Ethiopia survived that time. Ethiopia now faces another crisis, which I'm not sure isn't an existential crisis. The government has taken a police action, which is actually a military action against the northern province of Tigray, where Ethiopia's former rulers had returned to after 17 years in power. The humanitarian situation now in Tigray is deplorable, to say the least, and we have there the intervention of Eritrea, neighboring Eritrea, as well as possibly drones from the UAE. So thinking about our responsibility to protect what happened in Libya, and these other things that affect our alliance and how we work together to or not to intervene, what do you think we should be doing in Eritrea, Bob?
In Ethiopia and Eritrea? Yeah, I would think personally we need to have robust diplomacy actually with Eritrea and indeed regional actors to stop any potential destabilization. And I think that the United States administration can really play a major part in that. Very robust diplomacy would be my recommendation. Vis-a-vis what's happening in Ethiopia, obviously it's a very fragile and vulnerable situation at the moment, but there is scope, I think, to go forward. It's not going to happen overnight, to go forward without more civil war, I would hope. If one can bring along reforms and get general political consensus on the whole in the country, it's a very big and varied, important state with lots of nationalities and regions, but I think it's possible to go forward. But there needs to be a reform process and there needs to be dialogue. And, you know, there's got to be a fair amount of healing in Tigray as well. But I think the destabilization point's an important one. And I certainly think the United States can play a role in all of this, including, by the way, the coming elections in June, possibly with observers.
Stefan, should we be doing more?
I don't know what we're doing privately because our governments obviously won't tell the public opinion that. You remember when we were there were a lot of things we would do privately without telling everybody. So I hope they're doing more because so far, according to what I know, and I know very little, it doesn't seem that our governments are doing very much, but perhaps they're acting behind the curtains. I agree with you. I agree with Bob. The humanitarian situation in Tigray is appalling, in spite of all what the government is saying. And we should be especially worried about the refugee camps. Personally, I visited when I was there, the Shimelba refugee camp. It seems that this has been completely dismantled by the Eritrean troops, and many people have probably been taken back to Eritrea. We can only imagine what they've done to them. So we should certainly insist, I wouldn't say heavily, we have to be very skillfully. We know how proud the Ethiopians are, but insist on more humanitarian access and also access for observers, stressing that it is their ultimate interest, but it's tricky.
Thank you. I agree with you both. And now I'm going to turn it over to Sandy so we can do the questions and answers. Thank you again. It's been a wonderful discussion.
Yes,
Sandy?
indeed. It's been super. Thank you so much for all your insights. I want to start off with a great question from one of our board members, Tom Johnson. Of course, all ambassadors, one of their major roles is to report back to their home capital, their home country, on what's going on in the world. So do either of you have any knowledge or insight into what British or EU or French ambassadors in Washington, D.C. may have been reporting back home during the 4 years of the Trump administration?
We had one of our ambassadors returned early, if you remember, to the UK after a particular telegram was leaked. So I think the job of representatives on the ground is always to be honest and frank when reporting back home, and I think that's the approach we would all have taken. And I think I wouldn't want to comment more on that. It's in the public domain what happened in that particular episode with that former ambassador. But I think the job, just to say the job of an ambassador, it is important that there is this role that is respected of an ambassador to be, of course, a respectful emissary from abroad, but also to be very honest in his dealings with the local administration. Quite often that has been private, but to be honest and respectful, but to say what needs to be said, as well as encouraging, and also to be honest and clear when reporting back home. That's the job. It's not sometimes easy in certain circumstances, but I think at the moment I would be expecting the UK ambassador to be engaging across the front and being as helpful as possible in the sense of helping the Biden administration to reconnect, to re-engage where they need some insights or where they need some support in terms of making contacts and this and that. It's going to be an important year for diplomacy.
Stefan, you want to add anything to that?
Well, I agree with Bob. Reporting honestly and frankly is a part of our job, even if we know that it's not going to please our authorities, but we have to be able to say unpleasant things if necessary, because we have to inform our people back home. I'm not privy to what our embassy has told the ministry while Trump was in power. I can only guess, judging from a tweet which our then ambassador issued when Trump was elected, and which created some turmoil, even though on substance he was right. And I'm quite convinced, like Bob, that now the task is much easier than it used to be.
One question I want to ask to you, Bob, is something I've been long interested in. We know that there were some very high-level negotiations in London from the U.S. ambassador in the UK to try to lobby the the British government to stage the British Open at Trump's Turnberry Hotel. Were there sort of ripples created within UK diplomatic circles? Do you have any insight, or do you have any things to share from that particular moment?
I don't. I'm really sorry. I play golf. I am a Scot. I am interested in this whole question of Mr. Trump and his golf courses, but I don't have any insights, I'm afraid. I do apologize for that, but
not to worry. I had to ask.
Thanks for the question.
It's such a tricky,
interesting one.
Well, let's pull the lens back on Ethiopia a little bit and move to the continent of Africa itself. I know it's hard to create one vision for what the Biden administration ought to do in terms of its foreign policy priorities across Africa, but all of you here certainly have experience in other African countries. And maybe, Stefan, why don't I pitch this question to you first? What do you see as Biden's work to be done in Africa or within specific African countries?
Well, the first thing would be to demonstrate his interest in Africa. I've read somewhere that under the Trump administration, about half of the ambassadorial posts in Africa were not filled. There was a vacuum, which seemed to indicate that Trump and his administration didn't care very much about Africa, if this is true. Clearly, I hope, and I'm quite convinced, that the new administration will demonstrate interest in Africa politically, or sometimes in military terms, in increasing the fight against terrorism, particularly in the Sahel region, but not only, because now the cancer is spreading. Mozambique has been subjected to terrorist attacks. Some of those terrorist movements hint that they might attack Benin and Ivory Coast as well. I hope they won't be able to do it, but we shouldn't rule it out. But when I say helping to fight terrorism, it doesn't mean only acting in the military area. It means helping, favoring development projects on the ground, which help the population, especially the poorest, especially the most deprived areas in the north of Mali, in the north and the east of Burkina Faso, for instance. And last but not least, quietly encouraging the governments of those countries to improve their governance, because we know that the governance has been very poor. Sorry, I'm going to be blunt, but we know that in some of those countries, and especially in Mali in recent years, before the coup, there's been a lot of corruption at the highest level, both in the civil administration, at the political level, and in the military. And we know that it can make a difference. Just to give you an example, when Muhammad Buhari was elected president of Nigeria, all of a sudden, the Nigerian army scored significant success against Boko Haram. And the reason is very simple. For the first time, simple soldiers would be paid, because before, generals and high-ranking officers would just take the money and put it in their pockets. So it shows that improving governments and fighting corruptions can have a decisive effect on the effectiveness of both development action and military operations. Clearly, this is not easy because corruption is widespread, and we shouldn't give the impression that we want to interfere in those countries' domestic affairs, their sovereign countries, but there is a way to do it. You have to do it skillfully with the help of others, and even, I would say, and I'll end there, with the help of those countries whose interests are not so opposed to ours as we would tend to believe, like Russia and China. Because Russia and China also have an interest in the stability of those countries. And Russia and China, as we said before, had been subject to terrorism as well. So I think some international cooperation in that area could be useful. It should be limited to Western countries. Sandy, since I'm having the floor, I don't know how much time we have. There's one issue I'd like to raise in 20 seconds. We spoke about multilateralism. We spoke about climate change, the Paris Agreement. We might say a few words about WHO, which the US is joining again. Great, wonderful, fantastic. Let me just ask one question. How about UNESCO? Thank you.
UNESCO is a harder one. I hope we do it, but I don't think it's top priority. But I did want to answer the Africa one. Biden feels very strongly that Africa has to be a partner, and that's good. Biden has made counterterrorism a priority, and that to me means that we need to return the troops we pulled out of Somalia and the troops we pulled out of Niger, so that we can be a full partner in the Sahel with France and in Somalia with the EU. So I'm hopeful on Africa, but you know, Africa never is at the top until there's a crisis, and we'll see how things go, because it to some degree looks like the pandemic in some of the areas in Africa is beginning to gain ground. Bob?
Just two things. One is, it's good that the Biden administration have shown already that they're taking Africa a bit seriously by sending a special message to the African Union, the recent summit. And I think that's a very good message, a very good signal. And so I do expect re-engagement. There are things, actually quite exciting things, that we all need to do, and which perhaps, I'll give one example where America could play a lead role, which hits a number of targets. Why not a new kind of Marshall Plan, win-win-win, to help connect 565 million Africans who currently have no access to electricity? Why not help them to reconnect using new, clean solar energy powered technology, create jobs and industrialization on the ground, and through the jobs, by the way, reduce the unemployment and therefore the possibility that youngsters will be resorting to crime or even worse things because they have nothing to do. So it's a win-win-win-win idea. And actually, this is the year of climate change ambition as well. It could be a great way of America returning to the continent.
We-
They've left
we
it, but
need to-
really
we
returning
need- We need to pass that on to the Biden-Harris administration.
Yes, it's a UN project, by the way. And
Oh,
those 565 million, by the way, are 70% of the world's population without access to electricity are in Africa.
Let me go ahead.
Vicki, I just add a quick point. I think Bob has made a very important point. He's right. I'd like to add that there are two areas which we should not forget regarding Africa. One is supporting, as discreetly as possible, civil society organizations. The second is helping small and medium enterprises. I read recently, I think it was an EU document that we have to encourage. It was an EU-China document at some summit. The EU and China should encourage big projects. Well, fair enough. But I think leaving aside small and medium enterprises is a big mistake, because this is where young people, energetic people, entrepreneurs can demonstrate their ability and help their societies. And we should try and encourage those medium and small enterprises, and especially help them switch from the informal sector to the formal sector. This is a transition which is a key element, but we would need hours to discuss it. So I'll stop here.
Indeed, we could keep talking for many hours. I have no doubt. I'm going to ask you just one more question, and this one is for Bob, but of course, I'll feel free to chime in. It's a question from Anita Zednik. Hi, Anita. Bob, how do you see the effects of Brexit on international relations, whether that's with the United States or with Europe or with the rest of the world?
Well, we are where we are. By the way, we haven't left Europe. We haven't sort of motored off with some sort of outboard engine into some other ocean. We are European, and we will be very much wanting to remain very close to Europe and France, of course, and Germany and all the other states of Europe. Equally, we are in a way recreating as we speak our new international profile and role as we want it to be. There is currently a review going on in the UK. It'll be published shortly on where the government's priorities will pan out. But it's bound to be close relationship with Europe, and bound to be close relationship with the United States, and to have as much of an impact on key areas where we will choose where priority areas we can make a difference in the world. I would have thought that we will want to make a success of our new role. It's not quite clear where we will be going totally, but I do think there will be a very positive effort on the part of the UK to contribute, and that includes to continue to support old friends and to support the interests that we have identified for ourselves, and not to abandon those interests, but to stick with them, and to get where we want to go in new ways. We're not necessarily inside the room with the European Union, but we may well have very close links and be supporting the same sorts of objectives and policies in a coherent way on the ground.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Bob Doer, former ambassador for the UK. Thank you, Stefan Gompertz, former ambassador for France. Thank you, as always, to Ambassador Vicki Huddleston. This was a great conversation. I wish we could keep going on it, but thank you so much. Have a great evening to you, and to the rest of you out there, have a great day, and we look forward to seeing you again.
yes, I think we need to have another session on, only this one will be focused solely on Africa. Thank you so much, Bob and Stefan.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
A great pleasure.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, Andy.
You too.